I will call Alberto Costa to move the motion, and I'll then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention for 30-minute debates. Order, order. Alberto Costa to move the motion.
Good morning, and I beg to move that this House has considered the effectiveness of the Nolan Principles in local government. It is a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Desmond Swayne. This year marks the 30-year anniversary of the Nolan Principles. Let's just remind ourselves of those principles: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. Now, these 7 principles embody everything that we as elected representatives should strive for on behalf of our constituents. They are the guiding principles for anyone in elected office. MPs and elected representatives of all levels of local government are overwhelmingly publicly spirited and dedicated people who embody the Nolan Principles in their work, always. Now, having served on the Privileges and Standards Committees for the last 5 years, committees which I'm honoured to now chair, I've seen firsthand that elected representatives do, at times, sadly fall short of the principles. Of course.
Can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for bringing this forward, but does the Honourable Member not agree that for most honourable people the desire to live to the high standards of the Nolan Principles is inherent, and yet for those who do not live by these principles there must be more than a suggestion, but there must indeed be a requirement to stand by them? Does he agree?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his very welcome intervention, and I agree entirely with him. Not only should publicly elected councillors, both at parish, town, local authority, district and county level, be obliged to follow the principles, but importantly, those principles, a code of conduct developed and underpinned by those principles, has to have teeth. And I think that's what the honourable gentleman is ultimately saying, that there has to be appropriate sanctions, as there are, Mr Chairman, for all of us as members of this House. Now, some of those members that fall short, sometimes these are minor lapses, moments of frustration or poor judgment. Other times they are severe errors with devastating consequences for colleagues, staff and the reputation of elected office. Such errors aren't unique to elected representatives, but all people. To err is human. No human being is without flaws. That said, it is right that elected representatives, whilst undertaking their public duties, are held to a higher bar. This isn't about their private lives. It's about the work that we and authority councillors do in the course of their public duties. Yes, of course.
And for bringing this debate on the Nolan Principles, something I've been very interested for a long time working in public service. But in a digital-first world with so much of our lives documented and undertaken online, would the Honourable Member agree with me that this gives greater necessity for a reimagination of the Nolan Principles in a digital-first age?
I think that's a very interesting point that the honourable member makes, and I must confess, not one that I've given consideration to, and I would welcome further information from him on what he means by that, particularly in my role as chair of this House's Standards Committee. So I very much welcome any further briefing that he might offer on that. So the Nolan Principles must ensure that the elected representatives are held to account properly at every level of local government. Now, in Labour's government plan for local government reorganisation, the way that standards are dealt with in this new structure mustn't be neglected. And I would hope that the Minister might be able to say a few words on local government reorganisation and how he thinks the Nolan Principles in any code of conduct might underpin those principles. I do think that we can all agree that the current regime is failing. Issues of misconduct, bullying and harassment at local government, parish, town, county and district have got worse. I know of parish councillors in my constituency whose lives have been made a misery through months and in many cases years of verbal abuse, intimidation and harassment from fellow councillors. In Leicestershire, one instance of constant harassment and relentless vexatious complaints resulted in a parish council officer dramatically resigning during a parish council meeting. And I've no doubt that colleagues in this chamber today have witnessed or have heard of similar stories in their own constituencies. Now, this is a small minority of councillors, bad apples if you like, but even so, according to a 2017 report by the Society of Local Council Clerks, 15% of parish councils experience serious behaviour issues. 5% are effectively dysfunctional as a result of these serious behavioural issues. So where does the current regime, Mr. Chairman, fall short? Firstly, there is no clear definition of bullying or harassment in the Localism Act 2011. And this leaves it to monitoring officers to interpret vague codes of conduct inconsistently. What's serious in one district area is dismissed in another. Town and parish councils have no internal mechanism to investigate breaches of conduct. At the same time, principal authorities are also powerless to enforce meaningful sanctions, except in cases serious enough for criminal referral. The 2018 Ledbury Town Council case exposed a major flaw in the system. The council was forced to pay over £200,000 in legal fees for trying to sanction a councillor through an internal grievance process. It highlighted a fundamental problem. Parish councils lack the power to act independently, while principal authorities have no real enforcement mechanisms. Accountability falls into limbo unless there is a clear criminal conduct involved. And the speech today that I'm giving is not about criminal conduct. It is about the issues that we as members of this House are familiar with: bullying, sexual misconduct, harassment and the like. If the public were able to properly hold rogue councillors, the minority, to account at the ballot box, I'd be less concerned. But the gaps in legislation are made worse by the democratic deficit, certainly at the parish level, where elections often lack enough willing candidates to ensure true accountability. In May 2015, elections, for example, only 20% of eligible parishes contested their vacancies. Only 20%. The ballot box rarely holds councillors to account, and even by the time it does, it can often be too late. Now, going forward, we know that accountability problems will be more pronounced in areas that have a unitary authority, which is the direction of travel under this government, as parishes will be given even greater powers, potentially, due to the abolition of district councils. I hope the Minister can comment on what considerations the government is making specifically to this point. And if he isn't unaware today on what the government is considering, I'd be grateful if he could write to me after today's debate. For now, I would encourage the government to consider the following steps to strengthen accountability and protect town and parish councillors and those that work for town and parish councils. Firstly, I would suggest amending section 27 bracket 3 bracket, of the Localism Act 2011 to give a clear definition of bullying, explicitly covering persistent verbal abuse, intimidation, or behaviour that causes significant distress to other parish or town councillors or those that work for parish or town councils. This would give monitoring officers of principal authorities a firmer basis to act and set a threshold for escalation, distinguishing heated debate from harassment. Next, mandate standards committees in all principal authorities tasked with impartial investigations, deciding allegations and imposing sanctions. These committees, supported by truly independent persons, would bring consistency, credibility and impartiality into an appropriate disciplinary system. Indeed, here in the House of Commons, we have 7 lay members as part of the committee that I chair, alongside 7 members of Parliament. And as chair, I don't have a vote other than the event of a tie, meaning that the 7 lay members give the impartiality that the House wants when disciplining our own members.
Would the honourable gentleman be well?
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Sir Desmond, and thank you for giving way. The Nolan Principles also apply, of course, to officers working in the public sector. I am a regional mayor, as well as a member. I am aware that a regional mayor in the east of England is currently talking with a chief constable about officers prior to him being mayor, under the previous mayor, having made decisions that should have been made by politicians. In other words, the normal rules and policies were circumvented, it would seem. Now, one of the things that really troubles me, and I wonder what the honourable member thinks about this, is that interim officers working for local authorities, regional authorities, whatever it might be, move on quite quickly. They don't stay very long. And if it's then subsequently found that there is something that has been questionable, they are not bound to take part in any inquiry. That means that the Nolan Principles can be completely circumvented. It's like a coach and horses through the good principles, and I agree with everything you've said so far in your contribution. So could I ask you what your view is about that? Should there be a special circumstance, special modifications to the rules that allow those officers that keep moving around, going on to carry on working in local government, to be held to account? And could I also ask the Minister, what is the government going to do to make sure that where there are unquestionable things have happened, that the local authorities where these interim officers are going to are alerted or it's made known that these irregularities have taken place? Thank you.
Indeed. Well, I thank the honourable member for his welcome intervention. And again, he highlights another issue I'm not entirely familiar with. What I would say, however, is whilst this debate is concerned with elected officials, he rightly raises the question of what if those charged with oversight of Nolan Principles as independent officers then move on to other jurisdictions? Well, there is, of course, the contract of employment that underpins the duties of that individual. It may well be that there is a lacuna in this area, and again, I would welcome the honourable member writing to me for me to ascertain whether or not there's a linkage here to ensure that the mechanism that I'm proposing to the Minister, which is to have more appropriate oversight with independent officers, is not damaged by the point that the honourable gentleman makes. So I'd welcome further briefing on the matter by the honourable gentleman. So, mandating standards committees in all principal authorities tasked with impartial investigations, deciding the allegations, as I've indicated, would bring consistency. But thirdly, I would also suggest amending legislation to make parish councils formally accountable to their principal authority, which currently isn't the case. This could include annual governance reports, direct intervention powers for serious breaches, and the provision of training to prevent issues arising. These are basic bread and butter issues that we as members of Parliament of this House are encouraged to take more an active part in, particularly when it comes to training. Parishes should still retain autonomy, but the principal authority should act as a backstop for serious failures, reinforcing local governments without reverting to centralised control like the Standards Board. Finally, we must address the absence of robust sanctions. There is a total lack of sanctions when councillors at parish, town and local authority level have been found wanting, with the exception of criminal conduct, which is dealt with, of course, separately. The power to suspend councillors for, say, up to 6 months for proven bullying or harassment is essential. Currently, a councillor can shrug off consequences and return to the next meeting unchecked, and instead of facing consequences, effectively nothing is done. That doesn't just impact on the proper functioning of that parish or town council, but it impacts on the staff working for that parish or town council who may themselves be the victims of the bullying or harassment. Worse still, I've heard of cases where entire councils have resigned in despair, powerless against a single disruptive individual. Suspension would offer immediate relief to victims and signal that misconduct has a cost, as it does here in the House of Commons and as we've proven over the last few years. Much of what I'm saying echoes the 2019 review by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which itself called for councils to suspend councillors without allowances for up to 6 months. The government rejected these proposals in 2022, citing risks to free speech, which, while I sympathise with, but the new government's 2024 consultation on sanctions suggests a shift which I welcome. And maybe the Minister can say a few words about that. We must not return to a time of bureaucratic excess and politically motivated complaints threatening freedom of expression. That is not what I'm arguing for, and that's not what we see here in the House of Commons. But with reports of bullying rife at parish levels and changes to local government structure in the pipeline, it is time now to reconsider the recommendations of the 2019 Committee on Standards in Public Life. And I would encourage the government to take the opportunity it now has with local government reorganisation to make a positive impact in ensuring that what we see here in the House of Commons apply to all of us is mirrored in some form to other valued elected public officials. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the effectiveness of the Nolan Principles in local government. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to attend this debate today. I'm grateful to Honourable Member for South Leicestershire for bringing this debate. A key commitment of this government was to strengthen the standards regime and integrity in public life. And specifically, that means a very active commitment to work together to create a fit, legal and decent local government sector. A local government equipped to rise to the challenge and opportunity of increased devolution and power and resources from Whitehall. Our proposals to achieve this were set out in the English Devolution White Paper, published in December last year, and they include measures to fix our broken audit system, improving oversight and accountability, giving councils genuine freedoms to work for and deliver in the best interest of their communities, and with particular reference to the theme of this debate, improving the standards and conduct regime. And we are wasting no time in getting on with the task. The day after the English devolution white paper was published, we launched a 10-week consultation on strengthening the standards and conduct framework for local authorities in England. This consultation, which closed on the 26th of February, sought views on reforms to the standards and conduct regime so that the public can have trust and confidence that all councils in England can be effective and well governed. I should say, and I think the member was hinting towards it, if perhaps they didn't go quite as far as I may, I think the previous government, in the early part of the government, when we think about the removal of the standards regime, the removal of the audit regime, and even measures like taking away councils' pensions in England, I think many of us now reflect that those were in large parts acts of municipal vandalism, that they took away the architecture that allowed local government to thrive. And whilst that challenge is big, we do understand, of course, that we need to make significant steps to improve it. And we all know, all of us here today, the 7 principles of public life: honesty, integrity, objectivity, accountability, selfishness, openness and leadership, which all have aimed to underpin the ethical standards of all public office holders for the last 30 years. They are, and have been, the foundation of the Code of Conduct for members of this House, the Ministerial Code, and all who serve in local government and the wider public sector. Doug Chalmers, the current chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, gave a speech at the Institute for Government in November last year on the 30th anniversary of establishing the committee. In that speech, he reflected on the 3 golden threads that Lord Nolan has set out, needing to be delivered alongside the Nolan Principles themselves. Firstly, the Code of Conduct. Secondly, independent scrutiny. And thirdly, education. The Nolan Principles, as Lord Nolan himself acknowledged, were not a code of conduct, but more importantly, the values that would underpin a code of conduct. An effective code needs to be clearly detailed in the behaviours those in public office must observe to repay the public's trust and confidence, something that the member referred to, recognising that in itself the foundation is there, but the behavioural code isn't quite there. And there are examples in the councils that he mentioned, and actually right across the country, of where bad behaviour is far too familiar in some councils, and that can't stand. While the standards proposals the government has been consulting on for a whole system reform, at its foundation is the proposal for a mandatory code of conduct. We believe a mandatory code is vitally important to achieve consistency across all the various types and tiers of local government. The current regime simply requires all local authorities to adopt a code consistent with the Nolan Principles. Now, some take this de minimis approach of simply listing the 7 principles, while others have very detailed local codes. But this lack of consistency isn't helpful to the system overall. It's confusing, and it means that we can't have confidence that all are judged to the same standard equally across the system. And that's not something that happens in the devolved nations. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have mandatory codes of conduct in place, all based on the Nolan Principles, but setting out detailed interpretation of the behaviours that are expected. Of course.
For giving way, where there are bad behaviours, that often results in significant legal costs to the local authority and also settlement payments. And the government is giving more powers to combined authorities. Does he agree with me that where a combined authority incurs significant legal costs and settlement payments relating to staff that are left, whether employed or interim, that information should be shared in a timely fashion with board members? And if so, will he write to me just to confirm that is the government's position?
Yes, I mean, we've set out a very clear expectation about transparency, and all authorities, whether they're local authorities or combined authorities, always acting in the public interest and being upfront about information that they hold. So that expectation is clear. I can respond in writing in more detail. Yeah, of course.
Press on this specific point. Does that transparency include sharing those settlement payments and legal costs with the authority's own board members? It strikes me as remarkable if those costs are not even shared with board members. He's very helpfully just clarified he expects transparency. I would like that transparency to be with the public. Perhaps he can say on the public disclosure, but at least can he confirm it should be shared with board members?
Well, if I follow up after the debate on the particular example that he's obviously referring to, and I'll commit to, via the department, to find out a bit more information and respond in writing more formally on that. But as a matter of principle, it's not unreasonable to expect that board members, as opposed to wider publication, are informed of matters of financial relevance to the operation of the board. I mean, it seems fairly self-evident to me. But on the particular case, which I'm not familiar with, if he can provide more information, I'll certainly come back on that point. Now, I'm enormously grateful to the over 2,000 responses that we received to the Government Standards consultation. We're working at pace to analyse the results, and we'll be carefully thinking about how to take into account the views that were expressed for each one of the proposals that we set out. The Government response will be issued in due course, and after its release, we will continue to work actively with local government on developing detailed implementation. Now, on the point he mentioned about reorganisation, I have to say, although I completely acknowledge the examples of poor behaviour that he identifies, and I would say I've witnessed myself in some authorities too, I would be careful not to attach local government reorganisation as an inherent risk to the standards and behaviours of councillors. I think this is cultural. I think it's a lack of a framework, and I think, honestly, it's slightly a result of a standards regime that hasn't got teeth. That there are some members who know actually what they're doing isn't right, who know what they're doing isn't just about free speech, it's actually about abusing the position that they hold and the freedoms, and often you see that relationship where elected members have the court in the council chamber attacking officials on the top table who have no power to respond themselves. So you see that power imbalance taking place as well. I suspect that most elected members who are behaving in that way know exactly that that behaviour is not okay, but they also know that the standards regime has no teeth to deal with that, and so what's the consequences? And so I'd be careful not to attach it to the reorganisation point, because actually what we want to do is to rebuild the system from the ground up, so that every council, whether they're part of the 21 counties that are going through reorganisation or all of us in England, are subject to the same robust standards regime that does have teeth. And so to return to the title of the debate, and taking some of the points around we can't allow a system to be used for political end. It's got to be hold up to all scrutiny at all levels. That is about having a proportionate system that can hold up to scrutiny and be tested. But it has got to be mandatory. It has got to have sanctions that matter, and that would include the power of suspension, potentially, the power potentially to withhold allowances if that was correct, the power for potential premises bans if there was a safeguarding risk at play. We have examples where councillors can be on police bail for sexual assaults and during police bail can attend council meetings and attend the premises. Well, that clearly wouldn't be acceptable to most members of the public, but the current regime allows that to take place, and that cannot be allowed to stand. But also, and perhaps more controversially, disqualification in some cases for the most serious breaches. I can very briefly.
Address my point, or maybe write to me if there isn't time today, about interim officers. Thank you.
So we can do on the particular point around the interim officers being able to move around and whether or not they are held to the Nolan Principles as a founding principle. I can return to in writing. This is more about the standards regime that governs elected members in that context, and that's the consultation that we undertook. I have no doubt that the Nolan Principles have and will continue to be enormously influential in contributing to the effectiveness of local government. They are a prescription of the values to foster a culture of integrity and ethical behaviour. This government is committed at the heart of our ambition for local government to be fit, legal and decent for the whole of the sector. And this is what the public have a right to expect. To be effective, local government must serve to foster vibrant local democracy. It must encourage a wide diversity of talented people to step forward to represent their local communities in that position. And we are committed to working to that end.
The question is that this House has considered the effectiveness of the Nolan Principles in local government. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 2:30 o'clock. Thank you.